On the first day of his Middle East trip, President Donald Trump has already secured a $600 billion investment pledge with Saudi Arabia. Now, the trip is drawing no scrutiny over one glaring omission. Israel, America's closest ally in the region, is not on the itinerary. Now, recent moves by the Trump administration have led some Middle East experts to question the current strength of the U.S.-Israel alliance. Joining me now to unpack this is Dr. A.J. Nolte, Associate Professor and Director of the Institute for Israel Studies at Regent University. Dr. Nolte, welcome back to Washington Watch. Thanks for joining us.
Tony, it's always great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So let's just start with this. Let's start with the president's deal with Saudi Arabia. He teased this trip a couple of weeks ago, saying there are going to be some big announcements, and it was pretty clear that it was going to focus on economic activity. What do we make of the deal the president announced today?
I think this has as much to do with some of the recent post quote-unquote Liberation Day tariff politics as it does with anything else, in the sense that I think the president wants to show that America is still a strong place for investment. People still want to bring capital here. He wants to be able to show these successful international economic deals. And the Gulf is a good place to go for that. He's had very successful trips to Saudi Arabia. He had a very successful trip to Saudi Arabia early in his first administration. Who among us can forget the famous iconic image of President Trump and MBS touching the orb together to open the counterterrorism center? And so I think he's building on that, and he's going really looking for wins and looking for wins that will reassure markets and reassure investors. So I do think there are some Middle East security components to it, but I suspect that a lot more of that focus is sort of getting some big investment deals and showing that he's bringing capital into the United States.
So is that why Israel is not on the itinerary? I mean, he's going to Saudi Arabia, he's going to Qatar, he's going to the UAE, but not Israel, America's closest ally in the region. And that has some kind of scratching their head.
I think that is the reason why he's not going to Israel, because he's looking at these sort of Gulf economic deals. I do think that it could be that there are some folks in his orbit that don't understand the economic power of Israel. In other words, and we'll talk about this, I think, as we move forward, there's some people that tend to think the U.S.-Israel relationship is more one-sided than it is, that are really in Trump's orbit. And I would love to see Trump really thinking about Israel as an economic partner, understanding that by my count, over 30 states have trade offices in Israel. And my own home state, the Commonwealth of Virginia, has received $12 billion in FDI just in one state from Israel since 1995. So I think he just doesn't think about Israel in financial terms as an investor country in the United States. And so it might be worth, folks close to his orbit trying to change that perception. I think that could be beneficial.
I think that's a great point. In fact, when I was in Israel a couple of weeks ago with Ambassador Mike Huckabee, in his first speech that he made to the JNS Symposium Summit that was being held in Jerusalem, he made that point. He said, many see this as one-sided. It's not one-sided. It's a two-way street. We receive a lot from Israel. The technology that they export, I've been in like their drone manufacturing plant. They do a lot of stuff that we actually rely on, even for national security.
Absolutely. And one thing people sometimes forget is that a lot of that military aid that goes to Israel is also, we sometimes use the IDF for research and development. Their procurement system, no offense to our friends in the DoD, but Israel, sometimes their procurement system's a little bit faster. They can test and live test faster than we can. And so it's not just, they're a client of ours and we're buying bullets, which you sometimes hear from some folks, but actually they play a valuable role in our national security apparatus that we're not necessarily as well equipped to do in a couple of areas.
Well, that's true. They're always putting our material to the test because they're using it more frequently than we are. But one of the issues that has caused some consternation, I think the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been very circumspect on this. He hasn't raised it, but I have actually spoken to some members of the Knesset there. I've talked to other contacts in Israel. They're a bit concerned about the direct negotiations with Iran and the thinking that the Trump administration is putting forth that a deal could be arrived at with this ideologically driven regime.
I'll give you the optimistic and the pessimistic case on this one, Tony. So the optimistic case is after the Iraq Study Group came out, and this was back in 2000, gosh, the late 2000s, early 2010s. I had an opportunity to interview the late Ed Meese, who was a member, very conservative, and they advocated for direct talks with Iran. And his response is, well, Reagan negotiated directly with the Soviet Union. And so sometimes you have to have those direct peer-to-peer talks, especially on arms control issues, to be effective. So that's the optimistic case. The pessimistic case is when I see headlines that say that the Obama team is praising Trump and the Trump administration for their approach. Because the Obama team gave us the JCPOA, which was a disaster on so many levels. And so, I think that there are reasons for concern, and there are President Trump's instincts about JCPOA were very good. He said it was a terrible deal, and he eventually tore it up. And so, my hope is that he will remember those successful lessons from the past administration and realize that, to a certain extent, these folks are not going to negotiate in good faith. And I think Marco Rubio has been very right about no enrichment is a hard line for a civilian nuclear program. And so hopefully the Trump administration will stick to that.
Is there a difference in the foreign policy approach to the Middle East in Trump 2 versus Trump 1?
Absolutely. So here's the way that I would portray it. Trump 1 had a very consistent pro-Israel orientation, was very consistently hawkish on Iran, and sort of represented some of the best instincts on the Middle East that we've seen. And then if you look at sort of Obama and Biden, it was consistently the opposite. They were consistently dovish on Iran. They were consistently pushing Israel in ways that were undermining Israel's interests, and I would say not really representative of America's national security interests either. What we've seen thus far in Trump 2 is actually an inconsistency where it appears as though there are multiple different factions within the administration that have slightly different approaches to Middle East policy. And the president is sort of hedging and letting both of them sort of play things out a little bit to see whose assessment is best. I think the instincts that he has from Trump 1 are kind of still there, but his coalition has changed a little bit, and that means that there are different factions with different approaches, and I see him trying not to lean too hard one direction or the other.
So what do you make of the departure of Mike Waltz, who was the national security director?
Yeah, it's an interesting move because Waltz, I think, was in the Hawk camp. But, then he's replaced as temporary national security advisor by Marco Rubio, who I think has 4 or 5 jobs now in the administration, who's also kind of similarly situated. I mean, Marco Rubio's record is very long-standing on this issue. And so what I think that did was it didn't so much change the balance of power as it did clearly establish polarity in the administration, with J.D. Vance representing what I would call the more non-interventionist / restrainer camp, both in the Middle East and beyond, and Marco Rubio representing a fusion of MAGA with more traditional Republican policy. What's interesting is in the Meet the Press interview that Trump did about a week and a half ago now, when asked about successors, those were the 2 men that he mentioned. So I think he's partially also got an eye toward what happens, what his legacy is. And so there's been a little bit of a clarification now of those are the 2 different poles within the administration.
Now, Dr. Nolte, I'm what I call a rational isolationist. All right, I don't like to get involved. I don't think having as a veteran of the Marine Corps, I don't think we should be the world's policeman. I don't think we should be getting involved in all these different conflicts. The price is high. I do think there is a role that comes with leadership, and we are a leader of the free world, so I do think there's some element of leadership there. But I also think as an evangelical, I approach this from Bible-believing evangelical, that Israel falls into a different camp. And that we have to have, I think, a very clear biblical alignment with the Jewish people. That's not to say that we agree with everything that they do, but right. I think we need to be much more careful about our foreign policy approach to Israel.
Yeah, so my read is I probably would be a little bit more of a hawk, which isn't surprising to people who've heard me on Washington Watch before. But I certainly agree in terms of Israel. This is a vital interest for the United States for several reasons. One, because the Middle East is an area that is strategically important because of hydrocarbons, which is why he's in the Gulf, because of free navigation of the seas, which is why the issue with the Houthis is so important, and because it's just it's an area that has become a center point for global commerce, which is important to us. Also because of the biblical foundations, and finally because if you look at American history, as we're coming up on the 250th anniversary, so much of our founding DNA is actually related to the Hebrew roots, the biblical roots of American civilization. That, in other words, it really is a family issue. It's an issue of our national identity that links into our support for Israel as well.
I want to shift to one of the countries that President Trump is going to visit next, the country of Qatar. They have, well, let's put it this way. They would not make the role of a Sunday school class. They have some real issues. I mean, they're linked to the funding of Hamas. Many of the Hamas leaders have been given sanctuary in Qatar. I'm a bit concerned about a cozy relationship with that country.
I am more than a bit concerned, Tony. I'll give you a couple of additional data points. Number one, ISGAP, which is the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism program. It's in Oxford, has done studies of Qatar and has basically estimated that they've spent about $1 billion funding anti-Semitic and anti-Israel bias on U.S. campuses. That's billion with a B. Second is, in addition to what you mentioned about them supporting Hamas and every other Muslim Brotherhood aligned organ they could think of, Al Jazeera Arabic has basically been the platform and spokesperson for Hamas since the conflict started. Additionally, Qatar has also aligned itself in the past with Erdogan and opposed to the other Gulf countries to the point where they almost went to, they blockaded Qatar for a long time because they were so antithetical to the interests of even our Gulf allies. So Qatar is a very dangerous country in many ways. They will try to have their cake and eat it too. And I would be very cautious about trusting them. And one of the biggest concerns that I have about the Trump administration is there's a lot of folks with ties and investments and things like that in Qatar. Now, I understand business is business, but keep in mind that business and politics are separate, and that somebody who might be a good business partner when you're investing isn't necessarily a loyal ally with the United States. I think we've learned this lesson painfully about China in the past decade, and we need to not forget that lesson as we engage with Qatar.
We just have about 45 seconds left, Dr. Nolte. What about this $400 million 747 that they want to gift to President Trump?
My advice to the president would be to say, thanks, but no thanks. It's just too much entanglement. It's too complicated. It raises too many questions. Lord, we're, I think, probably all on this listening to this program, hopeful for an outcome that President Trump would like in the midterms. But imagine Democrats with the House Oversight gavel investigating this whole thing, and you could actually lose ground to them on national security. So I wouldn't touch it. I would say, thanks, appreciate the gesture, but I think we're going to pass for now.
Yeah, even if it's legal, it doesn't make it right. And I think it is not above the perception of. It's bad. So as the Bible says, not all things that are lawful are beneficial. Right. All right, Dr. Nolte, thanks so much for joining us. Always great to talk with you. Thanks for having me.